Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Today I'm going to be concluding my look at the Dungeon Magazine installments of the Shackled City Adventure Path. Today I'm going to be discussing Asylum. This adventure was originally released in Dungeon Magazine issue number 116 from November 2004. The adventure itself, Asylum, was designed for a group of 4 19th level characters who should reach 20th partway through the adventure. And if you're looking to go into epic levels, then you can certainly do that at the end of the adventure with the characters gaining their first epic level. But that's a whole other discussion in terms of what I thought of epic levels back in the days of 3rd edition. The adventure begins right after the events of Strike on Shatterhorn, where the characters went after the remaining members of the Cage Rights and dealt with all of them, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 who might have managed to escape, depending on how efficient the party was. Now, there's 2 different ways that you can start this adventure. In the last chapter, the last installment, Strike on the Shatterhorn, Embrul Elistani potentially could have made off with one of the player character's souls. And then she scooped up her unconscious body and used it and then teleported to the prison plane of Carcery. So the players may be wanting to go there to begin with to get away from her. So that's something that is a possible setup. Or if the player characters feel like they've accomplished everything that they needed to and simply want to, rest and recover from their ordeals, you can start the adventure the way that this one begins as well. The Beholder, Orbius Philanthru, makes his return in dramatic fashion, returning not as the Beholder that he was before, but a much larger, fiendish Beholder that also bears the sign of the Smoking Eye, something that the player characters had the potential, or one of the player characters had the potential to earn way back in the 5th installment of the Adventure Path, when they were traversing the plane of Ocypitus in the Abyss. With the Beholder attacking the survivors of Cauldron, the player characters have to jump to their rescue, and this is a pretty tough fight. This is a challenge rating 21 creature with some pretty decent spell-like abilities and resistances, and not too bad amount of hit points either. So this was a fairly decent way to start off the campaign or the adventure if you're looking to start with some action. With Philanthru defeated, there are questions as to how he was able to come back after being defeated by the player characters back when they went through his domain of oblivion. And for that, they turn to their friend Genya. So she is the High Priestess of St. Cuthbert, who has also served as sort of the main exposition for the campaign, using a sacred relic that the Church of St. Cuthbert currently has, known as the Star of Justice, I believe it's called. She's able to use divination spells and other powerful spells that she herself may be able to cast to learn a few things. The first thing that she learns is that the Cage Rights were merely merely pawns, or merely being manipulated by the fallen celestial, the current or rightful ruler of Ocypitus, the demon lord Adamarcus. Adamarcus has also had all mention or knowledge of him magically erased from different texts, religious texts, historical texts. Anywhere that his name may have been initially referenced was magically concealed until the defeat of the Cage Rights and the failure of the ritual of planar junction, in which the magic that obscured his name and his legacy is starting to fade. She also learned that Adamarcus is imprisoned in Skullrot, which is an asylum hidden somewhere on the first layer of Carcery. With the Cage Rights being defeated, his insanity has been driven to greater and greater levels, to the point where his madness is actually leaking through the planes and allowing him to do things like resurrect Philanthru. Now, if the characters don't feel like investigating or dealing with it, it does recommend that he can start resurrecting other enemies that they have defeated previously in the campaign, including even the dragon Hookface, the red dragon, in the event that they managed to kill the dragon way back when the city of Cauldron was on the verge of volcanic eruption. So there are different ways that he can manifest this and bring things back. She recommends that the player characters make their way into Carcery to find where the Skullrot Asylum is and put a stop to Adamarcus once and for all. The players also receive some unexpected assistance from the celestial guardian of the region, the Mavonic Deva known as Nidrama. So she was someone that helped the characters with some cryptic guidance or some cryptic messages way back when they were going to the Demon Scar back in the fourth installment, the Demon Scar Legacy, when the characters eventually ended up going to the Abyss in the at the end of that adventure. She's decided that she can no longer sit back and just watch passively as the events unfold the way that they have. She decides that it's time to take action and pledges herself to go with the player characters into Carcery to put a stop to Adamarcus once and for all and return the region to a relative form of peace. Once everything's decided, the next step is for the characters to make their way to Carcery itself, to the first level of it, also known as Orthris, or Othris, however you want to pronounce it. Here they have some encounters with some of the local creatures like the Demodans. There's a group of Slati that they may encounter, demons that are there, a group of marauders, the Stygian marauders, which are these tiefling, this troop of tieflings that are riding nightmares. And when the characters arrive there, they need to essentially investigate to try to find where the Skullrot Asylum is located. It only gives you a couple of locations to go to, one of which is a settlement known as the Bastion of Lost Hope, which is sort of this, I guess you'd call it like a marketplace, a town or city within Carcery where the characters can either make some skill checks, or spend a lot of money, like thousands of gold, I think 10,000 gold or more, to bribe people to give them information as to where they can find the Asylum of Skullrot. There is also another location of Harrowfell, which is this tower that happens to be occupied by a loyal servant of Adamarcus, a Merilith demon by the name of Bailaka. Now, one of the characters has the sign of the smoking eye. They may be able to convince her that they are the rightful ruler, and they want to know where Skullrot is, and she may have that information that she can pass on. Or they could, let her know that they're going to kill Adamarcus to become the rightful ruler, in which they may, trick her into revealing information or fight her for it, and get it from her before finishing her off. Or there's different ways to get the information out of her, but those are the two mainly recommended ways, or the ways that are covered in the magazine for the characters to get to Skullrot, which is this insane asylum where you just have like these cages that look very similar to the soul cages from the ritual of Planar Junction back in Cauldron. In addition, any of the escaping cage rights that the players may have been unable to defeat back in the strike on Shatterhorn, they can also be found here because they would have retreated to this location in an attempt to, free Adamarcus or simply seek shelter, and the characters may come across them basically just raving, ranting, just completely and totally insane, and trapped in one of the prison cells that are there. So it's sort of it's like a comeuppance sort of thing, but it also feels a little bit anticlimactic for those that manage to escape. But I'll discuss that a little bit more later on once I get past the main story here. So going through, you just have to fight some of the guards of the asylum itself, including the six-armed Demodand by the name of Hexavog. Not quite as weird or gross looking as Dirid, the one from the Ritual of Planar Junction under Cauldron, that had this like vestigial twin sort of just growing out of the side of his neck. But still a pretty weird, just fat, six-armed creature nonetheless. There's an advanced devourer that's in here as well. Some different types of demons. And the main warden of Skullrot, a lich fiend by the name of Dark Miracle. So lich fiends are these evil outsiders that become liches through something that's sort of a similar, it's a similar process, although I believe, if I recall correctly, they don't create phylacteries. It's their patron that they're loyal to or that they worship that controls their life force. So in the case of Dark Miracle, this lich fiend, his existence is subject to the whims of the demon lord Grazit. Now, I will talk more about Grazit and Adamarcus's connection to one another in a future video, because I do want to cover the hardcover compilation of the Shackled City Adventure Path, where it seems like more of that background information is made available, or that the characters may learn some of it. But let's just, for now, we'll just say that the two of them were rivals, and Grazit's actually the one who's responsible for Adamarcus's being imprisoned and the current level of insanity that he is experiencing. So with Dark Miracle defeated, the characters can finally make their way to the final encounter with Adamarcus himself. So Adamarcus is currently locked inside of his cage. Now his cage, again, is suspended, similar to how other ones that were shown on the outside of the Asylum were as well. And it looks very much, again, like the soul cages from the Cage Rights plans, which is obviously by design, because Adamarcus is the one that actually implanted that seed of information, or that design idea, into them. So his madness helped create the Cage Rights, and his surroundings is something that formed the design of things like the soul cages in the first place. Now, any of the player characters that don't have the Sign of the Smoking Eye template will look at this cage that he's in, which prevents all of his magical abilities from functioning and zaps his strength to the point where he can barely move at all. And they may just think that is perfectly fine just to leave him, because he's in this cage and doesn't look like there's any way getting out of it. If one of the characters has the Sign of the Smoking Eye template, however, they see the cage as this decrepit, rusting, falling apart structure that could be destroyed with a single weapon attack. In order for Adamarcus to be stopped, he has to be freed, and the only person that can free him, at least by default, is a character with the Sign of the Smoking Eye template. When the cage that was housing him was created by Grazit, he had to install some sort of flaw, or some sort of, basically some sort of key to releasing Adamarcus if need be. And the flaw that he built into it was that only the ruler of Occipitous can release him. And it made sense to him, because anyone that wanted to take over that plane, the last thing they would want to do is free the original ruler of that plane. So it made sense to him at the time, but since the characters had the chance to get that template way back in the 5th installment of the campaign, that sort of throws a little bit of a wrench in the works. On the other hand, if none of the characters have that template, either they didn't gain it in the first place, or they eventually lost it, which is something that could happen. If they died, their body is reformed on Occipitous, but each time that happens, there is a small chance that they might lose the template altogether. So that is something that could have happened. So if they don't have access to it, there are other ways to free them. So for example, they may require the cage should be simultaneously struck by a good aligned character and an evil aligned character. Nidrama, if she's with the party, she may be able to free him. So there's different ways to get around that. But ultimately, to truly stop Adamarcus, he has to be released from this cage. And once he is, now, if again, the players can just choose to walk away, and that's an ending that is accounted for in the magazine. But the real conclusion has them fighting this demon lord. And Adamarcus, let me tell you, he is a really interesting creature that I would honestly love to see be mentioned or brought back in some form in the future. So he has, again, to sort of briefly touch on his backstory, he was an astral deva. So he was one of the higher celestial creatures, and he was launching these attacks, or these crusades, into the abyss. Now, the cruelty that he saw there, and the old story, the story as old as time, I guess, is that his incursions into the abyss slowly chipped away at his sanity, to the point where he began to view the Celestials as the enemy. So he actually gathered up a horde of demons and launched an attack on Celestia itself. The only way to repel him was to destroy part of Celestia and have it sent into the abyss. So the part that he had controlled over during his incursion was cast into the abyss, which is what created the level of Akapitis, which has like the celestial rubble that causes demons to think that that level of the abyss is haunted. So when the characters discover him, he can be in one of two forms that he can switch back and forth between. One is his angelic form, which we see here. So in this form, he has his whip as well as this gauntlet attack that has like the brilliant energy property, as well as a few other things. The whip is brilliant energy, sorry, and his gauntlet is a chaotic weapon. So if he attacks a lawful creature, it does more damage against him. He also has several spell-like abilities and some unique attacks that he can do as well in that form. But he can also switch as a free action. He can switch between his angelic form and his demonic form. Now, both of these forms are completely and totally twisted and evil. So none of them are, going to be looking for redemption. None of them are going to be reasoned with. These are just two warped, twisted, evil personalities or forms. Each form has their own separate hit point total. So it is like fighting two very powerful creatures. Now, his demonic form has this ashen blade, which if it hits each round, the first time it hits in each round, the character that it gets struck by has to make a saving throw or take something like, I think it's like 20d6 damage or some just gross amount of damage that they could possibly sustain. So it is pretty brutal what he can do. But he also has these tentacles here, which have an enervating attack, meaning that they actually drain levels from the individual hit by them. So when you're struck by them, it's 1d4 levels, which if the same person's being attacked by these tentacles, not going to take very long before you get drained all the way to zero. And if your negative levels reaches zero, then your character is dead. So a very, very tough fight overall. Ultimately, if he's defeated, then the characters have sort of won for the day, and Adamarcus shouldn't threaten anyone anymore. His plans for the Cauldron region have been thoroughly disrupted, and he should pose no threat to anyone ever again. Or will he? So that's sort of, I guess you could call it a little bit of a cliffhanger, depending on how you want to deal with the encounter itself. But the campaign does effectively end, in the magazine version anyway, with his defeat. Be it in Skullrot itself, where his defeat is technically temporary, or if the characters, take the fight to him on the Akapitis itself, which is the only plane, the only place in the cosmos where he can actually be permanently killed. It's up to the DM to decide how to handle that or what to do with that moving forward. But that's it. That's the end of the campaign. So, what are my thoughts on the Shackled City adventure path as a whole? So overall, I will always have sort of a warm place in my heart for the Shackled City adventure path. This was the first campaign that I ever was able to run from its intended start point to its intended conclusion, all the way through. Prior to that, for the few years that I had been running stuff before that, it was either the end of the school year, prior to graduation, sort of brought an end to things, or the group was sort of difficult to work with to the point where DM fatigue set in to the point where I just didn't want to continue, or work schedules would get in the way. There were a lot of different reasons why early campaigns where I was never able to finish them. But this was the first one that I finally did run through to its conclusion. So there are some things I'm going to save in terms of my opinions or some points to bring up for the hardcover review. Because the hardcover does actually change some things around, but I will sort of at least touch on the major points here. So the first thing is that the Shackled City Adventure Path was sort of a gamble for Paizo at the time. I mean, Dungeon Magazine was not particularly popular, and this was something that once they started it, they were committed to seeing it all the way through. And when you were dedicating, originally it was supposed to be like 10 issues, but when you dedicate 11 issues of your magazine to this adventure path, this continuing story, if the if the consumers didn't like it, then that was going to be a major problem. Thankfully, it did go over relatively well, but the fact that it was this sort of a gamble or a risk for them did help drive the design behind the way that the adventures were structured. And I think that that idea or that mentality is both its greatest strength as well as its major weakness. So as far as the strength goes, the fact that all the adventures, or at least all the early adventures up until like the last two or three installments, had to be designed so that they could easily stand alone as just individual adventures in the event that the overall story wasn't well received by the consumers. It meant that they were designed in such a way that the players never felt like they were being railroaded into one story that just oppresses them throughout the entire career of their characters. Now, I will save this for my review of things like the Age of Worms adventure path, which I was also able to run all the way through to its conclusion. But one of the problems with that adventure path is the fact that from the very beginning to the very end, every single thing that's done in that adventure path is done for the sole purpose of driving the story forward. Whereas with the Shackled City adventure path, these feel like just separate things that occur in the region. It's just, like the area, the geographical location is the one thing that seems to connect these adventures, at least on to the player character's point of view. So rescuing orphans that have been captured and or potentially being sold off as slave labor to creatures of the Underdark, to recovering wands of controlled water to prevent the city from flooding during the raining season, to going into the Underdark to retrieve this dwarven defender that's been thought lost for years and years, going to a land that suffered a magical cataclysm to try to find this paladin that can bring stability to the political scene in the town that the adventure's taking place in. Exploring the abyss, a layer of the abyss that even demons consider to be haunted and try to stay away from unless absolutely necessary. Exploring underground ruins to find, ancient repositories of lore. All of these things all felt like very separate adventures that were only loosely connected together. It really wasn't until Lords of Oblivion that everything felt very, the dots were connected, and everything from that point forward was very directly related to what came before, to a point where it's very clear to see. Now, those early adventures were all still connected as well, but only the Dungeon Master really got that because they got to see what was going on behind the scenes where the player characters weren't able to. So it felt like a fresh just batch of adventures that the characters went on before finding out what the main story was. So I think that was something that actually works really, really well, because it does feel like things are fresh and things are different, and it doesn't feel like you're just stuck on this one path like it's something that's happened in future installments. So that was something that I consider to be a really good strength of the campaign itself. The downside is that this structure also made it difficult to really convey the importance of what's going on. So the Cage Rights, their reveal set them to be the campaign villains, and the natural conclusion to the campaign, honestly, is when the characters shackle the tree of, or the tree which the ritual planar junction is being conducted on, with the shackled, or with the Cage Rights and the Shackleborn and the soul cages and everything. So once they stopped the ritual of planar junction, that felt like the natural conclusion to the campaign. Having the characters then go to, destroy or defeat the last few remaining members of the Cage Rights felt like a little bit like padding, and the Asylum adventure felt even more like it, because if the shackling of the tree of or the dispersal. So the biggest flaw with the Shackle City Adventure path was the fact that it was very difficult for the characters to truly understand what's going on around them. With the reveal of the cage rights in the Lords of Oblivion chapter, it really felt like they were the main antagonists, the main villains of the story. And the natural conclusion to the Shackled City Adventure path really felt like it was when the ritual of planar junction was disrupted, when the characters placed the dispersal collar on the Tree of Shackled Souls in the fiery sanctum beneath Cauldron, putting an end to that ritual and defeating enough members of the Cage Rights organization that it would take a very long time for them to be able to rebuild and try again if they ever could. Now, if that wasn't the natural conclusion, then the next installment, where they go into the ruins of Shatterhorn to defeat the last few remaining members, again, that felt like the natural ending point. But to be honest, when I was running it for my group, the consensus was that that part felt a little bit like padding, and just trying to continue the story, even though they accomplished what their main objective really was. But the biggest problem is that that was not the final chapter still. So Asylum really felt like it was just drawing out and padding things out with this introduction of Adamarcus seemingly out of nowhere. He is mentioned by the insane Blackguard in Strike on the Shatterhorn, where he believes himself to be Adamarcus. But that's a name that the characters probably haven't heard since they went to the Abyss. And honestly, it's easy enough for them to forget the significance of that name. So when the Blackguard calls himself Adamarcus, they may simply just believe that he is. So the fact that you then say, oh, well, there's this demon lord that's actually behind everything, and now you need to kill him, because if you don't, he's going to keep sending these reincarnated villains after you over and over and over and over and over again. It just feels a little bit forced and really anticlimactic. The other major problem with it is that he's imprisoned, and the way to defeat him involves actually releasing him so that he can become a direct threat instead of a passive one. And my group's initial thoughts were to simply leave him, and they, after defeating Dark Miracle, just decide that, you know what, that should be fine. He's in this cage, and we're done. And that's something that the magazine does address, but it just, again, if that's the way that the campaign ends, that is a major, major letdown. And if that's the way that your group ended things, then they may not ever want to run through something like Age of Worms or Savage Tide, or transition into Pathfinder at the time and go through things like the Rise of the Rune Lords or Curse of the Crimson Throne, or any of the other awesome adventure paths to come out after that. That's not to say that it's, again, the encounter itself was a great deal of fun. I really enjoyed running it, and my players really enjoyed the challenge that this Demon Lord presented. Having him be able to switch back and forth as a free action between these two separate forms with their own hit point pool and everything else, their own separate attacks and their own separate feel to them. It was great. It was an awesome encounter. The two forms also react differently to the sign of the smoking eye. So the demon form, I believe, looks at them as a rival and will attack them almost exclusively, whereas the angelic form views them as a potential ally and will attack anyone but them. So it's sort of, like I said, it was an interesting thing to do, but it just wasn't executed in the strongest way. Again, it felt like you kind of had to force the final encounter, not to mention the fact that defeating him in Carcery doesn't actually defeat him. Anyone with the Sign of the Smoking Eye template just simply reincarnates on Ocapitus, and Ocapitus is the only place where someone with the Sign of the Smoking Eye can be permanently killed, meaning that if the characters defeat him in Carcery, then they also have to go to the Abyss and defeat him again, which also kind of draws things out. Now, when I ran this particular encounter, I had him plane shift away. Now, the prison, or the asylum itself, does have magical wards in effect that prevent teleportation magic from working. So my sort of way of getting around that was to simply say that that was directly connected to Dark Miracle's presence, and with him defeated, the teleportation wards that prevented characters from or creatures from plane shifting or teleporting away had simply failed. Now, again, that's sort of a bit of a cop out, and I do recognize that. But the reason that I had him do that is once he took enough damage, he plane shifted, and the characters had to go to Akapitis in order to finally finish him off. Now, I had the benefit of having a character that had the Sign of the Smoking Eye template that was very attached to the idea of ruling that level of the Abyss and trying to turn it into a celestial refuge. So there was a natural drive to go there and to finish him off once and for all. But that's something that if you're running this adventure path, you're going to have to try to figure out how you want to present Adamarcus and how you want that final encounter to go down. My suggestion would be to have him feel more prevalent throughout the campaign, but again, I'm not going to talk about that too much right now because there is still the hardcover, which does change things enough, or does it's best to help that be the case where he's mentioned a little bit more. So I'll save the rest of my thoughts for when I get to review the hardcover of that. Overall, though, I really loved this campaign, and of all the adventure paths from Dungeon Magazine, the 3 that were released during the 3rd edition era, this is the one that I would honestly want to go back and run again first for 5th edition, or to update it for a modern edition. This is the one that I want to run because of the fact that the adventures are structured in such a way that they feel they feel like they're only connected by the region, while the dungeon master knows the true extent of things. I like the less oppressive story over something where everything is blatantly connected and the players just feel like they can't escape from that story even for a few encounters. So that's the reason that I really want to run this again. But it was great. There's a lot of great writing into it. There were, like I said, a few things that I would change, but I will save that for the hardcover review. So if any of you watching this have gone through the entire Shackled City adventure path, let me know in the comments below, how did you as a DM, or how did your DM if you were a player, handle the introduction of Adamarcus with the Asylum chapter? How did they handle the encounter with him? What did the group do? Did they simply walk away? Were they driven to defeat him from the onset, or did they almost feel an obligation, after the fact? So let me know how that went, because I always love to hear that from individuals that have had, the pleasure of going through this storyline. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Take care.